Prime Minister is increasing the pressure on Queensland and WA, calling on both states to sign up to the National Disability Insurance Scheme at this Friday's COAG meeting. At a federal level, the NDIS has bipartisan support, though neither side of politics has explained how they'll fund the $15 billion a year scheme. But there is funding for the 5 launch sites. This is a trial which will be up and running from July next year. So how will these sites work, and what will they mean for people living with disability? Madeline Jenner has more.
Each of the 5 NDIS launch sites will operate in a slightly different way. In South Australia, the focus will be on children up to the age of 14. In Tasmania, it's available to young adults, and in Victoria, the insurance scheme will be open to all people with a disability living in the Barwon area.
So for us in this region, we've got approximately 4,000 people currently receiving state-funded supports, and that's either disability services or early childhood intervention services or even psychiatric disability support services.
Jackie Pearce is the NDIS coordinator at Kringle, a disability support service in Geelong.
So there's approximately 4,000 at the moment, which means that an additional 1,000 people will be able to start receiving funded supports, and that's a fantastic outcome.
And obviously there are changes for the 4,000 people who do receive some services now, but you must also see people coming through your organisation who are getting nothing at the moment, but will do under an NDIS.
Absolutely, and we're not talking Taj Mahal type services, we are talking basic fundamental support. So a lady that I know has been on the waiting list for 9 years to get state-funded supports to have things as simple as a daily shower or some assistance with going out and doing her shopping or her cooking or whatever the issue might be. So we know people that have been waiting for years to get some kind of funding to support them to lead a regular life.
One of the fundamental shifts that will occur under the disability insurance scheme is that people will have greater access to the types of services they want. And that means service providers need to change too. Claire Robbs is the Chief Executive of Life Without Barriers. The organisation runs a large disability service in the Hunter region, home to the New South Wales launch site. Like the Victorian model, the New South Wales launch site will be available to all people with a disability in that particular area.
As an organisation, we're going through a complete transformation, really, of the shape of our disability services, because we have to be ready for an NDIS, but also because we ought to, because we want to be an organisation that when families and individuals have the choice of where they will purchase their support from, that they will choose to purchase it from Life Without Barriers. So there's a large part here for the sector having to gear up and be ready for this change so we can respond.
Right now, some service providers are still worried that they haven't seen enough detail about exactly how the launch sites will work and what changes they'll have to make. But Ken Baker, CEO of National Disability Services, says all the progress is headed in the right direction. Yesterday, both the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, and the opposition leader, Tony Abbott, reaffirmed their support for a national disability insurance scheme. Ken Baker says he is optimistic.
Well, it's because this scheme is a marathon rather than a sprint, and it will be implemented over several years. It's because of that bipartisanship or cross-party support is so important, and not only cross-party support at a national level, but also in each state and territory, because this is a joint state-Commonwealth project.
But already not everyone agrees. Queensland's working on its own trial, and neither Queensland nor WA have signed up to a launch site.
Well, they've given in-principle support to the NDIS, and that's important. It's true they don't have launch sites at this stage, but that's because they had disagreements with the Australian government around funding and governance. And those funding and governance issues are still big issues to resolve. But I think in the long term, I think they are committed to the NDIS and they will come on board.
You mentioned funding, and that's always going to be an issue when it comes to the NDIS. At the end of the day, do you believe that a levy will be necessary for this scheme to be rolled out nationally?
Look, I think ultimately it's up to governments what mechanism they use to fund this. The important thing is that governments attach high priority to this major reform.
And back in Geelong, Jackie Pearce says people are pleased that the launch site funding lasts for 3 years, but they're also determined to make sure that the funding continues beyond the length of the trial.
Look, I think there's a real mixture of probably anticipation mixed with some anxiety, because this is a huge social reform to the way disability services have been managed in the past in Australia. So I think there's a wonderful Martin Luther King quote that always comes to mind, which talks about take the first step in faith. You won't necessarily be able to see the whole staircase, but just take that first step. And that's part of the problem with being one of the launch sites. We haven't got the whole staircase in sight yet. We haven't seen the final legislation that will guide the National Disability Insurance Scheme. What we do know is that the system at the moment is broken, and it doesn't work well for people with disabilities.
Alongside the launch sites, the federal government has also set up a $10 million practical design fund to help prepare for the introduction of the insurance scheme. Yesterday, the government announced 73 successful projects that will share the cash. Among them is a company called Ability Technology, which is developing a website to help people find out about the types of technological assistance they might be able to receive. Dr. Graham Smith is the company's executive director.
Our idea was that people don't know what they don't know, and what we wanted to do was to help them expand their options. And the way we've come up with is to have a multimedia website where a person would go on a journey through a virtual reality home, and as they move through the home, they would be able to point with the mouse to items, hotspots in the house, and that would open up information about how they could control a light or a bed or the TV.
And from there, a person can find out about the types of services that might be available and be put in contact with organisations that can provide them. Graham Smith says the NDIS could really change the lives of people with disabilities, but there's not much point if they don't know what's available.
I think that's going to be a new experience for many people who have had their visions limited by disability and lack of funding. So now they'll be able to broaden their horizons, and little projects like ours will help them do that, whereas before they just didn't have that opportunity. It was a waste of time to think of possibilities.
Brings to mind that phrase that Alan Fells was titled his report into mental health last week, A Constructive Life. That was Dr. Graham Smith. He's Executive Director of Ability Technology, ending that report by Madeline Jenner. And after 8, we're going to have a look at the issues surrounding children with disability, because the statistics are horrible. The truth is, kids with disability are more likely to suffer abuse and neglect, and a report out today looks at why and what needs to be done to help some of our most vulnerable children.